New York Giants head coach Brian Daboll didn't ask for my opinion, but I'm going to lay out my suggested plan for how the team should handle preseason game reps. Locked on Giants starts now.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all of my written work. And as always, we welcome on in our Blue Crew community members, our everydayers, our newcomers, and everybody in between. And we thank you for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And if you make us your first listen of the day, we thank you for that as well. All right, on today's Locked On Giants podcast, Brian Daboll is never going to reach out and ask for advice from a member of the media, least of all me. But, there's been a lot of talk about what he should do with regards to the preseason and whether he should play the starters, and if so, how much he should play the starters. Well, you guys know, if you're an everydayer, you know how I feel about that. But I came up with a plan, a suggestion that I think kind of combines the best of both worlds. And I'm going to talk about that in our first segment. All right. Then in segment 2, the unofficial depth chart, the first one of the year, is out. And I have some takeaways. Really, not a whole lot of surprises, but some interesting things that I'm going to discuss with you when we get to segment 2. And then finally in segment 3, a segment we're going to call 5 Guys. These are 5 guys who absolutely better show something in these preseason games. And no, they're not necessarily rookies. So you'll find out who they are when we get to segment 3. So again, welcome on into everybody. All right, let's talk about this. All right. If you are an everydayer, or if you have read me over on New York Giants on SI, you know how I feel about the Giants and slow starts and getting the starters some reps. All right. The numbers, as I think I've given to you before, the last 2 week 1 regular season games, the Giants have been outscored 68-6. But the more damning stat is that the Giants in those 2 games have only scored 3 points in the first half. That's over the 2 games. I mean, can we say slow as molasses start for the New York Giants? And oh, by the way, they lost both of those games. And you have heard me say also on this program that the Giants, because they have 2 games against division opponents to start this year's campaign, they better go at least 1-1, if not 2-0. Because if they don't, they're going to have some big problems and a big hole to climb out of. So that leads us to the preseason games. Now, Brian Daboll probably knows what he wants to do, but he's not telling the media. He doesn't tell us anything. It's just kind of weird. I don't know what the big secret is, because it's not like, the outcome of these preseason games is going to count against the standings and the playoff seeding later in the year. But he's not revealing it. Now, maybe legitimately he doesn't know, possibly, but maybe he's still trying to figure it out. He spoke to the media on Tuesday via a video call, and he said, he did a lot of research on that in the off season and is trying to come up with the best plan for the organization. Yeah, we've heard it all before. Well, I'm going to give you what I would do. If Daboll had come to me, which again, he'll never do, but if he had come to me and said, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Here's what I would tell him. All right. I would definitely play the starters. Now, not all of them. There are some guys that you don't need to play because you know what you got in them. Dexter Lawrence comes to mind. Malik Neighbors comes to mind. Tyrone Tracy, I would consider holding out. A few others. Okay. So I wouldn't necessarily play those guys. But what I would definitely do on the offensive side of the ball, I would play the starting offensive line, which I understand doesn't have Andrew Thomas, but still I would get the line they've been running with for the first team offense. I would get them out there. I would put Russell Wilson out there. Now, The reason for that is let them get used to the cadence in a game situation. There is no substitution for game speed. You just can't replicate it in practice. The blocking is not as intense as it is in a game during practices. So let Russell Wilson and that offensive line get together and let them get used to the cadence in a game speed scenario, especially when you consider that there have been some problems between John Michael Schmitz at center and Russell Wilson and whatever quarterbacks have taken first team reps with the snap. All right. So just get them in there, let them get into a flow. Now, as far as like the game plan, and we know there's no game planning in the preseason, even if you're putting Russell Wilson in there and you're saying to him, okay, Russ, just hand the ball off. We're going to play Devin Singletary. We're going to play newcomer Jonathan Ward. We're going to play Dante Miller. Just hand the ball off. But the important thing is to get the cadence down. And, this is a golden opportunity. Get that cadence down. Let them get used to one another in a game scenario. And, if you want to try a few short passes, maybe something to the flat, maybe these little flares or bubble screens or whatever, you can throw a few of those in, but primarily look to run the game. Play Russell Wilson, play the offensive line for a couple of series, I should say, and then pull them out. All right. So when Russell Wilson is done for the night, pull the starting offensive line out. There's no reason for them to play beyond, at least for this first week, for them to play beyond 2 series. All right. So you put your second team offensive line in, and assuming, the next quarterback up will probably be Jameis Winston, or it could be Jackson Dart. I personally think it's going to be Winston. Let him play with the backups. That's when you can maybe, see what you have in terms of these receivers, for example, who are trying to make the roster at the bottom of the depth chart. What you could see in your offensive line depth when you're trying to settle that out. Okay. So, that's where you plug in Evan Neal, see if he can handle pass pro at that guard spot. So just kind of, give Russell Wilson and the starting offensive line a couple series, then give way to whether it be Jameis Winston, Jackson Dart, Tommy DeVito, whoever's number 2 on the quarterback list. And that's when you can kind of balance it out and see, okay, look, we got the starters some work, we got the backups some work, and we can further evaluate what we have in the backups and the guys at the bottom of the depth chart who are competing for roster spots. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, all right, I would play, with the exception of Dexter Lawrence, I would play the starting run defense. We all know that the run defense for this team has been atrocious the last, 2-3 years. Get those guys some reps, okay? Again, they're doing it in practice, but it's not the same speed. It's not the same intensity. Get those guys some reps and just see how they go at it. Because look, I think we could all probably agree that it would be surprising if Buffalo plays Josh Allen and all the top receivers and weapons that he has. They don't need to. They are a little further along than the Giants. They know what they've got. So their needs for their particular roster are to, get the guys at the bottom of the depth chart more work. So let the Giants, who are, like I said, a little further off from the Bills in terms of being a competitive team or a playoff challenger, let the Giants get a lot of work, or at least 2 series worth of work with their starters. See how that run defense looks. See how the pass rush looks. Get all that in. And then you can pull all your starters out that you choose to play, and then go with the depth on the defensive side of the ball. So the way I see it, it's the best of both worlds. You're getting the starters a little bit of work, but you're also spending time evaluating what you have at the bottom of the depth chart, which again, Brian Daboll in his call, as a matter of fact, I think in response to a question I asked, he said there's no substitution for game reps. So look, you got 3 weeks of preseason games to get these guys ready. Don't waste them. If you want to hold them out against the Jets because you got the joint practices, okay, I could see that. Come week 3, when they face the Patriots, don't sit the starters. make that a dress rehearsal if you have to, because then you're talking about a really long layover if you don't get those starters out there for week 3, if you hold them out. And you just don't want to do that. You just don't want another situation where you're getting blown out of the water in week 1 in a game that you can win, by the way. I've said it earlier in the week. I talked about the Giants can beat Washington. They played them close last year. I do believe they can beat Washington, but they better be ready. And let's face it, folks, the Giants have not looked ready the last 2 regular season openings. That's got to change. All right. Now, coming up next, the depth chart, the first unofficial depth chart of summer is out. So we are going to take a look at some of the revelations, if you will, and I'm going to give you some of my thoughts on that. That's coming up right after this. Hey, Giant fans, summer sports are in full swing. And whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it a little bit more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. New to FanDuel? New customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. So go on, open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And coming up on tomorrow, I'm kind of flipping a couple of shows here. This show that I'm taping for you was originally supposed to be my Thursday show, but I'm running it on Wednesday. So what I would plan to run on Wednesday, which if those of you who kind of visited, whether it be the YouTube channel or the audio channels, you probably saw something that said, "Can Russell Wilson ignite New York Giants red zone revival?" That's going to be tomorrow's show. All right. So I'm just flipping things around a little bit because I wanted to get to some of the hot topics, one of which we're going to talk about now, which is the unofficial depth chart. Emphasis on official. This depth chart is put together by the Giants PR staff as part of their weekly game release. This is usually based on snaps, seniority, whatever you want to call it. It is not handed down by the coaches. That being said, a lot of times the unofficial depth chart is pretty close to what you're going to see if the coaches were drawing up the depth chart. So let's talk about some of the things that kind of jumped out at me. All right. For the most part, not a whole lot, but there were a few things. I'm going to start with right tackle. And I found it interesting as well as, encouraging that behind starter Jermaine Illuminor, the backup listed at right tackle is not Stone Forsythe. It is rookie Marcus Bowe. Now, Marcus Bowe is a player who I think has looked really good in his reps so far in training camp. Now, I'm curious to see how he does in live game reps, but I was kind of glad to see that he's ahead of Stone Forsythe. Stone Forsythe, tries to give his best there, but I think the rookie's a little bit more ahead of him at this point, especially considering I think they envision Marcus Bowe as the future swing tackle, if not the future right tackle. So I was happy to see that on the unofficial depth chart. Okay, at right guard, no surprise here, but Greg Van Roten is listed ahead of Evan Neal, who, by the way, is listed ahead of Jake Kubas. Now, until we see otherwise, it is Greg Van Roten's job to lose. But I do think ultimately the Giants would like to see Evan Neal win that job. It's not a reflection on Greg Van Roten, who's a very good player. He could also become, if he loses that starting job, he can become the key swing guy, right? The interior swing guy playing backup center and backup guard at any of the guard spots. So I think the Giants would like to see Evan Neal win that job. Now, what's also kind of interesting is Jake Kubas is behind Evan Neal. That could be an experience thing, all right? But remember, this is Evan Neal's really first year of learning to play the guard position at this level. Jake Kubas is a guy who I believe if he makes the roster, and I'd be surprised if he doesn't, but he is a guy who maybe down the line can challenge for a guard position. He's not going to do it this year, obviously, but next year when you start looking at the cap cuts, the potential cap cuts, maybe there's a spot or there will be an opening for Jake Kubas to really, challenge for his position at that point. All right, moving on, staying with the offense. Not a surprise here. I know some people were surprised by this, but Devin Singletary is listed ahead of Cam Scatterbo. Folks, I've said it before with regards to Cam Scatterbo. He's got to go out there and show that he can pass pro. That's going to be the tipping point to him passing Devin Singletary on the depth chart. Devin Singletary is the best blocking running back this team has right now. So I am not surprised that Singletary is ahead of Scatterbo. Scatterbo, I don't even think is going to play this weekend because he's dealing with, again, what is believed to be a hamstring injury. So I don't expect to see Scatterbo. And quite honestly, if he ends up missing the entire preseason slate, he's going to sit probably behind, depending on the severity of his injury, that is, but he'll sit at that number 3 spot. Right now, if that injury is significant and he ends up missing, the next 3 weeks, maybe he goes to IR, all right, with the designation to return. So curious again to see, because, look, Brian Daboll doesn't tell us much in the way of injuries and how severe something is. And we don't really know until really we get to the regular season and we get the injury reports and then we get to see, at the start of practice, who's working, who's not working. So right now it's kind of up in the air. I can't really sit here and tell you that, yes, Scatterbo is definitely going to be on the 53 and not move to the IR list. And by the way, for those of you who said, well, what about if they move him to PUP? They can't move him to PUP. Once a player passes his physical to start training camp, he cannot go to PUP if he is injured during training camp. It's either they carry him or he goes to IR, but they can designate him to return. So we'll keep an eye on that, obviously, with Scatterbo, but the more reps he misses, that's not really going to help him a whole lot. Okay, quarterback. Jameis Winston is listed ahead of Jackson Dart, but you know what? That's one of those situations where you wonder if Jackson Dart is competing for quarterback 2. He's taken a lot of reps at quarterback 2. Right now, this could just be, let's just see what we've got. Let's get him ready. Let's advance him a little bit. But I think when push comes to shove, Winston's going to start this season as quarterback 2. Dart will be quarterback 3. But I do think at some point in the regular season, Dart will leapfrog over Winston because, as I've said before on the show, if Dart is quarterback 3, he's not getting in games unless Wilson and Winston both can't play. And at some point, I could see them wanting to push him up to quarterback 2 to give him some garbage time reps, if for no other reason, so that he can get used to the cadence, the game speed, and all that good stuff. So that I could see happening. All right, let's go to the defensive side of the ball. At cornerback, we'll start with cornerback. Deontay Banks or Cordell Flott. That's how it's listed on the depth chart. Cordell Flott is banged up. He's a good player, but he always seems to get banged up. I don't know what it is with him, but he seems to be an injury magnet. So I would say right now it's probably Banks' job to lose, right? If you can't practice, you can't compete. Cordell Flott hasn't been able to practice the last couple of days or so. How's he going to compete? He's not, right? All right. At nickelback, this kind of made me happy to see. Drew Phillips, obviously the starter, but Nick Jones is listed as the backup. Nick Jones has had a pretty good camp so far. He's been a little quiet the last week or so, but he's had a good camp. So I'm curious to see how he does as the nickelback, the backup to Drew Phillips, if he can win that job. At outside linebacker, I know this is going to upset a few people, but Abdul Carter is listed behind Brian Burns. Now, you're not going to sit Brian Burns, but what's kind of interesting about this is that They don't have Abdul Carter behind Kayvon Thibodeau. And a lot of people, I think, thought that Carter would challenge Thibodeau for the starting job. Well, not quite. I forget which coach it was, but somebody made the comment that um, Carter and Burns kind of do the same thing. They're kind of like the same player as far as their skill set goes. The only difference being is that, you know, Carter has had experience playing inside. So I could kind of see the logic behind the lineup here. And for what it's worth, the backup, if you will, for Thibodeau is Chauncey Golston. So you wonder if they're going to have Thibodeau play more with his hand in the dirt. Certainly have him moving forward if you're the Giants. But I just thought that was interesting, and I think Carter is probably we'll see him start. I would think at some point, but right now he's not really a starter given what's in front of him. The only other kind of surprise for me on the step chart, Raheem Nunez Roches is hanging on to that defensive tackle spot next to Dexter Lawrence. Now, I thought maybe Roy Robertson Harris would pass him on the depth chart, but as I said on the show earlier this week, the backup depth, or I should say the rest of the defensive line depth besides Dexter Lawrence, hasn't exactly been overwhelming. So there's still competition there. I know I've listed Raheem Nunez Roches as a possible cap cut. I still think that can happen, but he's hanging on. So these next 3 weeks going to be big ones for him in terms of whether he hangs on or whether he does become a cap casualty. All right, coming up next, we're going to do a segment called Five Guys. These are guys who really better step up in these preseason games that's coming up right after this. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. It's the best time of year. NFL kickoff is almost here, and that means fantasy football season is back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning up things with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, I'm playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first timer or a veteran making your millionth league. Whether you're all in on something new or you like sticking to head-to-head leagues or jumping into public leagues, Yahoo has you covered. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout the month of August. To kick it off, they just dropped Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now's the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you could still play in head-to-head private leagues or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And Wednesday, the Giants they're back on the practice field with a padded practice. The coordinators are due to speak. So we'll see what that practice yields. I just have so much content to get to this week. So we'll see what that practice yields as far as takeaways go. Then, of course, on Saturday, the Giants open up the preseason at Buffalo. I will have a show for you after that game. So we've got plenty of stuff coming up here on the Locked On Giants podcast, and hope you will stay tuned in. All right. In this segment, we're going to look at a segment called Five Guys. All right. I chose 5 guys who need to really step up in the preseason. Some of whom are going to be obvious, some of whom might not be obvious. I mentioned one at the tail end of the last segment, defensive tackle Raheem Nunez Roches. As I said before, the defensive line depth outside of Dexter Lawrence, not knocking me off my feet. Let's put it that way. So Nacho, given his cap number, has a very good chance of being a cap hit. So this is a big preseason for him. If he's going to finish out his contract or if he's going to be sent packing. So he's definitely one. Center John Michael Schmitz is another. Schmitz has had some problems with the snaps. The physicality, in his game hasn't been consistent. He's got to step up, right? The metrics, you look at the metrics and they're not very good. And while he has gotten better year over year, he's still not where I think a lot of people thought he would be at this point. Player number 3, obviously, Deonte Banks. He's got to not have those stupid mistakes that we've seen him make during the practices where he doesn't turn his head around when the ball is coming. He's got to learn to better read what the receiver is doing and play off of that. And, there's been some improvement the last couple of practices he's been in, but you want to see that in a game, because in a game, it's just bang, bang. So you want to make sure that everything is consistent. And as I said, with Cordell Flott injured, Banks has a chance to sew up that cornerback 2 starting job. Jalen Hyatt, another guy who has to have a big preseason. Now, Hyatt has worked hard. He's looked good. The injury that he had kind of set him back a little bit, but he has a chance to finish out the summer strong. And, I keep still seeing some people say, well, the Giants should sign Gabe Davis. They're not going to sign Gabe Davis if, number one, Hyatt steps up and can do what they need him to do, which is basically, I think, what they would probably ask of Gabe Davis. But more importantly, right now, as I understand it, Gabe Davis isn't quite 100% recovered from his knee injury that cost him last season. So pretty much it's the ball's in Hyatt's court, so to speak. And then finally, kicker Graham Gano. Now, there is optimism that Gano will be Mr. Automatic once again. Obviously he had the injuries the last couple of years, but as I've said before, if you're out there on the field, you are expected to do your job and do it at a high enough level. So when you see your kicker on field goal attempts of 40 plus yards over the last 2 years only have a 70% conversion rate, he's not doing his job at a high enough level. And again, Gano has a very high cap hit. I think he's the second highest cap hit amongst kickers in the NFL. He has got to play for that. Okay. I understand that, you're kind of in a make or break year for the coaching staff, and you probably don't want to have to start over with a rookie kicker or an inexperienced kicker, as would be the case if they were to roll with Jude McIntyre. I get that. You want a guy who's clutch, but, injuries aside, can we all agree that Gano hasn't been clutch when he has been out there? I think he can get back to that if he is healthy, but you have to wonder how much have the injuries kind of taken away from his leg strength? And is that going to be a problem going forward to where now the Giants have to worry about that if they need a long field goal? Hopefully they won't need a long field goal. Hopefully they won't need to to rely on Gano as much as they have, the last couple of years or so. But if they do, you want to know that Gano can come through for you, whether it's a 40-yarder, a 50-yarder, or a chip shot. And, I think the last few years, a couple of years, that hasn't been the case. So he's got to have a big game. Now, I don't know what the intent, the plan is for him for kicking. I don't know if I would imagine they're going to probably split the reps between him and McIntyre. But when Gano gets sent out there, hopefully he makes those kicks regardless of the distance. All right, Giant fans, that is going to do it for this edition of Locked On Giants. I want to thank you, as always, for tuning in. It is appreciated. Before we say goodbye, please consider checking out Locked On Bets. Betting experts Lee Sterling and Kevin Rodgers have daily MLB locks and can't miss football features. Find Locked On Bets on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Giant fans, tomorrow we're going to take a look at the Red Zone, a show titled Russ in the Red Zone. So make sure you tune in. And of course, if we have any breaking news or anything like that, I will bring that to you here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.